Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Today we're going to be talking about what kiln I would suggest you buy as a beginner. Maybe you're in the market for a brand new kiln, maybe you're in the market to just get yourself a used kiln, or maybe you don't know anything about kilns and you just came here to see what things you might need to set up in your house before you even think about getting a kiln. Whatever your needs might be, we're going to do a broad stroke of all the kilns that I've had experience with, and I'm also going to give you my recommendation at the end of this video for what I would have gotten if I had the money, time, setup, etc., and the knowledge that I have now as a potter. Now, before we start this video, I do want to say that this is just my opinions that are based off of my experience. The recommendation or recommendations that I'm about to make to you today are going to be based off of the stuff that I've worked with. I've worked with everything from raku kilns to pit fire kilns to reduction kilns at cone 10 to oxidation kilns myself with good old Redrix here. And while I haven't worked with every single different type of kiln in the world, I have a pretty good base of experience for a lot of kilns, the way they work, and for quite some time I even used a manual kiln. I didn't have this fancy dancy one you see behind you that cost a bunch of money. Some of you might even remember, if you've been with the channel long enough, that I had like this broken down elements poking out kiln that was super secondhand, but I loved that kiln. I named it and it served me really well. But I do want to get across the point to you that this is not the end all be all say all for what you should buy as a beginner. Go ahead, shop around, look at your options. There's a bunch of different kilns out there and they cater to a bunch of different types of people. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about a bunch of kilns, the experiences I had with them, what I prefer, what I like, what I don't like, and maybe you can find what works out for you. Now, the majority of people watching this video are probably one of about 2 or 3 different categories of person, right? They're looking for recommendations on what they're gonna buy for a used kiln because they're not buying a big boy brand new kiln like the one I have here. They're just looking for something to get them by for the moment until they can get enough money to either buy a better kiln, or they're looking for something to kind of practice on until they can move on to the next step. And then there's the people who are looking to buy a brand new kiln. They wanna see the schematics. They wanna know where to get information. And the third kind of person really just kind of knows what they want already. They just want a second opinion, or they want some type of confirmation as to like, hey, I want to buy this scut kiln, but I want to see what you think about it first. Person that I watch and click like and subscribe every week on YouTube because I love him. With that in mind, I have some timestamps for you up here. This first timestamp is very important because it's going to skip a good portion of the video. This portion of the video is what I'm going to call the hard talk. This, like my other video that I talked about what you would like to buy for your very first wheel, or some of my suggestions on the very first wheel you might want to buy if you're thinking about buying a wheel, is kind of like me trying to purposely take the wind out of your sails. I do this out of love. It's not the type of talk that I'm trying to discourage you from getting into the clay world. I'm not trying to gatekeep you, but it is the kind of talk that your dad would give you when he sits you down and goes,
"Okay, buddy, do you really want to get a dog? Is it something that you're gonna love and take care of every single day of your life and walk and talk to and love? Or did you just see someone else has a dog and you think it'd be super cool to have a dog?"
So this is your chance right now. If you don't want to hear that talk, I heavily suggest you go to that timestamp. The rest of all the timestamps right here are important things. I realize that some of you are just looking for information on a used kiln, some of you are looking for it on a brand new kiln, some of you are looking for it on your next purchase, as I named earlier. This means that certain sections of the video are specifically for you. The second timestamp is going to be stuff that you absolutely need before you even think about buying a kiln, new or used or next purchase. It doesn't matter. These are the things that you're going to need before you start to even think about buying a kiln. In the third timestamp, we're going to go over stuff that you need to look for when you're buying a used kiln. These are things that are going to help you avoid getting jebaited. I don't want any of you guys buying a kiln, taking it home, and then being like, oh, the sitter is just completely missing, and I just don't want that for you guys. In the fourth timestamp, we're gonna go over a couple of different types of kilns. I know a lot of you who don't have your own kilns or wheels understand that there are different types of kilns, but you've probably only seen what you've seen on YouTube, especially if you're in a very secluded area, right? You've seen my Scut 1027 KMT right here, you've seen my Scut 181, you've seen John's 1027, you've seen maybe some salt fire, some pit fire kilns, but I bet you don't know about commercial kilns, or tester kilns, or coffin kilns at all. And those are things that we're gonna lightly touch on while going in depth on the stuff that I would usually recommend for you. In the 5th timestamp, we're gonna take some of those kilns and break those things down. So what is a tester kiln? How does one use a tester kiln? What is a coffin kiln? How does one use a coffin kiln? What does your kiln have for its specs, Dante? Well, is this a medium-sized kiln or is this a small-sized kiln? Because when I look on the website, it says medium, but I don't really know what medium means in the scope of a kiln. What is the difference in between reduction and oxidation? And can I do both inside of one kiln? In the 6th timestamp, we are going to talk about preferences that I would like for myself. Things that really help me out on a daily basis. For example, you guys know that I have a touchscreen kiln. It's just easier for a lot of people who don't know how to deal with kilns. But please remember that I had a manual kiln for quite some time. Some people prefer manual kilns. They like to stay up all night, watch their kiln, put it on low for 2 hours for the candle bisque, put it on medium for 2 hours on both notches for the candle, for your bisque, and then turn it on to high and close it and vent it. And the final timestamp, which also kind of serves as another get out of jail free card for you guys, is the kiln that I would recommend getting for any beginner who has the time, space, money, electrical, breaker, box, ampage, like all the things that would be set up, the amount of room, everything. If I had what I have now and like $3,000 to spare, I would have bought the kiln that I'm going to recommend on that timestamp. This is also your chance, though, to go straight to that timestamp. If you're the kind of person that's already tired of me talking, then you can just click that, see the recommendation, maybe confirm what you were already gonna buy, and be on your way. Just make sure to click the like button as a little thank you. Okay, now that we made it past all the timestamps, we're gonna start with the hard talk. There are a lot of things you need before even thinking about buying a kiln. You're gonna need a lot of space. I am in a garage. A garage seems to do fine. You're gonna need a lot of time on your hands. You're gonna need a lot of money. This is not a non-expensive art. If you think you can buy a kiln and just be set, then you're sadly mistaken. In fact, I would heavily suggest buying a wheel before you think about buying a kiln. And before you think about buying either one wheel or kiln, I heavily suggest you go to a studio, or you go to a friend's house, or you go somewhere like take a college class, anything of that nature that will stop you from spending 3 to 4 G's on a kiln and a wheel and rearranging a part of your entire life. This is me not trying to discourage you or gatekeep you from the art form of ceramic art. I would love to have more people on the Dirty Potter team, for sure. I love you all. But at the same time, I've seen far too many people with money burning holes in their pockets who usually just retired and are like, I just want something to do. And so they go out and buy themselves a $3,000 kiln and a wheel, thinking that it'll be just as easy and rewarding as they see on YouTube. And it's not. In my experience, they usually give up within a year. I want to get the perception out of your mind that doing ceramic artwork is a fallback to just making money for a job you don't have, or a way to immediately make money. This might be a separate conversation, but I do absolutely think that ceramic artwork, when done correctly, is an avenue to make money with, right? But if you don't know anything about wheels or kilns and you think that you're just gonna make dinky little bowls all day and rake in a bunch of cash and be a famous artist, you are sadly mistaken. That is very untrue. This craft takes a very long time, a lot of dedication, and you will definitely have to put in your 10,000 hours before you even get to a place where you are considered to be good enough to start selling your stuff if that is your interest. If you're just looking for a hobby, please go somewhere that has these things available, right? But please don't spend $3,000-$4,000 because you're interested in dipping your toe into the water of ceramic artwork. Not only does it cost an extreme amount of money for this craft, and I only named the wheel and the kiln, I didn't mention the glazes or the clay or the equipment other than these two at all, which is probably another G or two. I also just don't want you to spend that amount of money because you romanticized something and then didn't have the proper setup. They're basically taking all of this work and just going, I just want something. But in reality, you don't really have the infrastructure or the knowledge of doing it. It's kind of like somebody who wants a really big, fast European sports model car with all the bells and whistles, but you don't even have your driver's license yet. So just to end off this little hard talk we're having right now with each other, I would heavily suggest you go get more experienced with mostly a wheel instead of a kiln, because a kiln secondhand is a great thing to get experience with. I heavily suggest you buy a secondhand kiln before you buy a brand new kiln. This is really a deterrent for people who like have too much money and time on their hands and think it's going to be the greatest thing in the world before they realize it takes hours and years of dedication and practice. This might be a little bit of a low blow, but if you're the kind of person that clicked the link up there to skip the hard talk, or you clicked all the way at the bottom just get to the end of the video, that immediately shows me that you don't have the patience to do this art form, which means you kind of you just disqualified yourself, honestly. I know I make a lot of car comparisons in these videos, but it really is like somebody wanting the best high-end model of like Tesla, or like the newest, best, most expensive car to like show it off, or they think they romanticize, it's gonna be awesome, I'm gonna pop wheelies and do cartwheels, and then they don't even have their license. Or it's kind of like the white belt who really wants to do a backflip because he saw the black belt do it one time and he's like, that's all I want to do, but he doesn't understand the amount of work and dedication it took to get to that point. I know I'm being a little bit blunt about it, but if you're watching this and this is getting through to you at all and you're really thinking about it, please get a little bit of practice in beforehand. At most, if you really have money burning a hole in your pocket, buy yourself a wheel and practice with it a little bit, because I would safely say if you can't center and make a bowl, there's no reason you need to buy your own kiln. You could very easily be borrowing a kiln or going to a studio, and if you don't have those two options, the best, and I mean the best decision you can make is buy yourself a tester kiln, where you can fire like 5 things at a time, because you're probably not going to be able to keep all your work. You might get S-cracks, you might get losses. That happens to me even, and that's just stuff that happens in the clay world. You're going to lose stuff. You're going to have to deal with loss on a certain level. And this is my way of saying this is not like a college class that you can just take and get free credits from because you thought it was fun. If you take that class, it's going to be hard. And if you don't pass, or you don't at least make a couple of things a month, the teacher's going to fail you, and then you're going to be like, oh, I thought it was going to be easy, and it's not. Me making this little hard talk for you is in that same light. I don't want you to think this is going to be easy, because it's absolutely not. And I don't want you to spend like $3,000 or $4,000 on something that you thought was going to be fun and easy, because by the point it gets fun and easy, you've gone through the drudge. You definitely have gone through it to get to that point. Okay, we got past the hard talk. Hopefully you guys listened to the hard talk. It was a very important talk. Before we get started, we're going to talk about the things that you absolutely need before you even think about getting a kiln. You can't just buy a kiln, bring it into your house, and think it's just going to plug into an outlet or a socket and you're all good to go. For example, you need a dedicated breaker for your kiln. Your kiln needs to be wired all the way up. You can probably see it right behind my kiln, that wire right there, going all the way around to a breaker box. That breaker box has a flip switch that is basically the kill switch. It is my dedicated breaker to my KMT 1027. All kilns need to have one of these, and every single kiln also has a certain amount of ampage, much like most of the stuff in your house, for every single type of breaker. For example, my kiln takes a 60 amp breaker, but this is a little bit troubling, especially for someone like me, because my house only outputs 100 amps at a time, which means when this thing is running, it's taking about 60% of my house's power while I run it at a time. I mean, technically speaking, on the specs, it says it only takes up to like 48 or 50 amps, but for safety reasons, you probably understand why they need to put a 60 amp breaker in there. Because my kiln takes 60 amps out of the 100 amps that it puts out, that means that I'm running this kiln in the dead of night. My dishwasher takes 30 amps. My washer for my clothes takes 30 amps. My dryer takes 30 amps. And my microwave probably takes like 10 or 12 amps, all right? While they're all running. I cannot run my kiln, my microwave, my dishwasher, my washing machine for my clothes, and my dryer all at the same time. One of those breakers is gonna flip, and I pray to the clay lords that it's not the one with my artwork in it. So I heavily suggest you go ahead and check that breaker box before you decide to actually buy your kiln. Not only do you need your own dedicated breaker a little bit above the amount of ampage that your kiln probably takes, you also need to fit a plug into your wall. It's like a brand new socket. Every single kiln comes with a special form or a special type of plug that goes into a socket. For example, one of the kilns I was looking at earlier has one of these plugs on it. Go ahead and take a good long gander at it. It is not European. It's not some weird plug that's like from another place you've never heard of. This is a plug that would go into my wall. I live in America. We're used to all of our plugs looking like this. your kiln is probably going to take a special plug that looks a little bit like this. So before you even think about getting a kiln, there's a couple of things you need to check. Number one, I want you to go to your breaker box or hire someone to do it for you if you're not comfortable with it, because you might have to switch some stuff around, which means if you're not an electrician, you're probably gonna have to hire an electrician for this job, which is gonna cost a little bit for sure. For me to wire this house to my 100 amp kiln and get this big long hose over here and do the breaker and all the boxes and all that, it was about $1,000. I did not do it myself, I hired someone to do it for me, which is why it was so expensive. Along with that, you also have to see if the kiln that you're thinking about buying is gonna take up like all the amps in your house. I don't think this is a thing, but let's just say for sake of argument, there's a 50 amp house in the world and your kiln, this one, takes 60 amps. You're not plugging that into the house. It's not happening. Aside from those two things, you're gonna have to have adequate space for your kiln. My kiln, as all kilns should be, is at least 18 to 2 feet away from any wall or burnable substance. It's the reason why a lot of my shelves around me, besides like maybe one behind me here, is made of metal instead of wood. You're not supposed to have anything burnable close to your kiln. This is a box that goes well over 2,000 degrees. So I feel like I shouldn't have to explain why that's a rule. Because of these two things, it's kind of sad, because if you don't have your own house, it's a little bit difficult to set up a kiln. If you're in an apartment, you probably don't have access to the breaker box. And if you do, I'm willing to bet they're not gonna let you install an entire kiln. And even if you did get that far, even in a magical world where you got that far, you can't really put a kiln, especially if you're on the upper level, in an apartment unless you live in like a condo where you happen to have your own garage. It's a very rare circumstance in which somebody can put a kiln in an apartment. And even then, it's not gonna be one of this size. You might be able to get away with a tester kiln, but we'll talk about those later. The other thing you kind of need definitely goes with the space thing I was talking about. You need enough space for the heat and air and chemicals that come out of the kiln to kind of air out. This is especially important considering you might not want to buy an entire ventilation system for your kiln. I would suggest getting a ventilation system when you buy the kiln, although it is absolutely not necessary. The high majority of potters that I know do not have a ventilation system, but I will say having one definitely helps the longevity of your kiln. But do keep in mind, like if I installed a ventilation system right here, it's either going to go up, so it's going to go through my roof, which means I have to hire someone to make a giant hole in my roof, or it's gonna go to the side, which is gonna go out of my house, which means again, I have to put a vent and a hole, you know what I mean? Like, there's a whole another $1,000 construction thing going on there. But I will say the majority of potters that I know, including myself, don't have them, and I'm still making like this quality of work. Especially if you get a used kiln, it's used. I wouldn't worry about it too much. If I were you, after I was done watching this video, I would go to Clay King, I would go to some online store and see all the schematics of the kilns that I'm interested in, see how many amps they take, see the plug size, see if I can find someone to get me a dedicated breaker. You know, you might have somebody in town who can do it, and have that stuff kind of hashed out before you decide to pull the trigger on actually buying a kiln. There's nothing worse than getting one of these beautiful babies in your house and being like, it doesn't plug into anything. I wish somebody would have told me about this beforehand. As a side note, there seem to be a lot of you on my Instagram DMs and on my Facebook fan page messages who are worried about what the kiln sits on, right? All kilns usually are sold with this type of stand, and you can probably see it right now. My kiln's sitting on it. You see it right there? My kiln is technically off of the ground. Your kiln should not be sitting on the ground. This means if you're buying a used kiln, although we're not to that section yet, you most likely want to ask either where the stand is or procure yourself a stand before you decide to buy it of that size. The kiln make and model should be on the front of the kiln somewhere, or at least on the side of it, much like mine is right here. Please do not, as I have said many times to other potters who've asked me this question on my Facebook and Instagram and Discord and the like, put it on a carpet or put it on a piece of wood for the same reasons that I named earlier when I said you do not want this close to anything burnable. It is a box of fire that goes well above 2,000 degrees. And I feel like I should not have to explain why it should not be next to burnable substances. So absolutely do not put it, especially if you're buying a used one, on just... I wish I was making this up. Some of you think I'm talking to you like you're stupid right now, but I honestly have these questions and these concerns in my DMs. Please make sure that your kiln is away from anything burnable, and to be honest, you might get away with putting it a little closer to the walls. But don't put it on a piece of carpet or wood. It's a box of fire. Why would you do such a thing? The best thing you can do for it if you don't have a stand for it is get like 4 or 5 cinder blocks and put it on that. That should be a good enough stand. But if you're buying a new kiln, make sure it comes with the stand. And absolutely, if you buy a used kiln, make sure you at least have something to elevate it off of the ground. I'm putting it right here on a concrete surface, so it wouldn't be that bad if I did, but I still would never do that because duh. Okay, now let's talk about what you should look for when you're buying a used kiln. This is probably the subject that I think most people want because a lot of people are smart enough to want to get practice with a kiln before they buy a brand new kiln and don't have any experience with it. And good on you, honestly. First, we're going to go over the things that you should look out for when you're buying a used kiln. Then we're going to go over the stuff that I personally do, or at least did, when I was looking for a kiln that had already been heavily used by someone else. Let's start with this. This kiln is relatively new, and because of that, the elements, which are the little coils on the inside of these channels, are still pretty new. They're not broken, they're not popping out, nothing's really wrong with them. These, just to give you a depiction of what brand new kiln elements and the inside of a brick looks like, is a brand new setup. The elements aren't popping out, they're not coming out of their channels, they're nice and tight together, they're not sprung apart too much, which happens when they've been overused sometimes. None of the brick is cracked. This is a very new setup for a kiln. Granted, while you buy a new kiln, you're most likely not going to find stuff that new and pristine. You're going to find stuff that looked like my old kiln. You're going to find stuff that had wires popping out, some of the brick was chipped off, but you know what? That was a really good kiln, and it lasted us a good time on the channel. So I want to separate this idealism now for you. I don't want you to think just because something that you might buy used looks a little bit messed up and doesn't look pristine like that, that absolutely doesn't mean it's not a good kiln, and it absolutely doesn't mean it won't work for you. But it does absolutely decrease the value of the kiln if you see elements that are popping out of the channels like this. If you see soft brick that is like this. If you see the bottom of the kiln that has absolutely a bunch of cracks in it and is probably going to let out a bunch of heat, which is kind of the job of a kiln, is to keep in heat, right? And that looks like this. If all 3 of these things are going on in a kiln, it better be a really nice kiln for a really low price, or else I'm not going for it. Because at this point, you pretty much just told me that it's been overused to the point where there's cracks at the bottom and the sides of it. It's gonna let out some heat. The channels are broken apart, which means that the kiln elements are probably popping out. And even if you just change the elements and they look super cool and nice and tight together, well, now they're just gonna pop out and touch my pottery. I know plenty of potters that have exceedingly good work with a kiln that looks like my old Scut 181. It again is kind of like buying a car. A used kiln will definitely get you from point A to point B. My job at the moment is to tell you how fast and how reliable it's gonna get you from point A to point B. So these are the things that I want you to look out for when you're buying a used kiln. Number 1, I want you to make sure the elements, which are the little spirally things on the inside of the channels, these are channels, and on the inside of them, those are called the elements. Those are the things that heat up and make the pottery go real hot fire time. The brick is what keeps all the heat that the elements make inside of the kiln and enclosed in the kiln, and that's what does all the work on your pottery. Good, brand new, nice elements usually don't look rusted, number 1, and number 2, they're usually tight knit together. They're coiled up really nicely and really tightly inside those channels. If you ever see elements that look like this, or they look like this and they're spread apart and they're not tightly knit coiled together in a line or at least a curve, they're kind of like a giant spiral or they're far apart from each other, those are bad or at least overly used elements. This isn't too much of a problem because if you buy a used kiln and the elements still work, but you see elements of this nature, this means that you just have to change the elements, which are really easy. Scut has a video that I'll link down below for you. They show you how to change the elements yourself. And if they don't do it, I'm sure the pottery shop in your local area will do it. The second thing I want you to watch out for when you're getting a used kiln is the brick. Remember last time I said the brick is the thing that really holds in the heat that the elements make? Well, the less brick you have, or at least the more chip that it is, the less heat you're gonna be able to hold inside the kiln. It doesn't really matter if the elements make heat if there's not enough brick in there to like really hold that heat in. And after a while, the brick starts to get old. The last thing that I want you to watch out for as far as the visibility of the kiln, not really the workability of the kiln, because it could look bad and work fantastic, much like my old Scut 181. Looked super gross, but it worked just fine and got us through this YouTube channel for like a year and a half to 2 years. Some of the OGs of the channel will definitely remember that kiln. The visual thing I want you to look out for are cracks in the kiln. If you look all the way down to the kiln, the bottom where there's not like an extra shelf, make sure they're not covering it with an extra shelf. Ask them if you see it. Ask them to take the shelf away so you can see the clear bottom of the kiln. If there's a bunch of cracks in it, it's gonna leak a little bit of heat, which is fine to a certain extent, but if you have all three of these problems at once, you basically have a poor functioning kiln. Yeah, it might serve as a bisque machine. Yeah, it might get your stuff up to cone 4, cone 5, but it's not gonna get it up as fast. You're probably gonna waste a lot of electricity. My last kiln fired off and it took about 13 hours for a glaze load, which is insane because a glaze load in this kiln takes like 7 or 8 hours. With this thing that is bigger and fits way more stuff in it than my old Scut 181, which was categorized as a small kiln, this technically is saving more money and electricity simply because it's a better kiln. It's way healthier, it just works more functionally. As far as the workability of the kiln, I want you to do a good job at checking the thermocouple and the setter. The thermocouple looks like this, okay? It doesn't need to be brand new, but an old broken down thermocouple will usually look like this. If you don't have a thermocouple in the kiln, because some of them don't if they're really old, like my Scut didn't, you at least need to make sure the kiln sitter is there. The kiln sitter is the thing that you put the cone into. The cone will melt and set the sitter off, and that's basically what tells the kiln to go off without you having to watch it or flip the breaker yourself. I'm trying to put as many visual aids up here as I can, but I did make a video about how to run a Scut 181. It's an old video, it's super cringy for me to watch it, but if you watch it, you'll get to see what a kiln sitter looks like. You'll also get to see where to place the cone, how to place it, and how to set a manual kiln. Right? I heavily suggest if you don't know any of this terminology to go and watch that. It'll give you a very vague version of what we're talking about here. For the final part of this segment, I'm gonna tell you guys what I do when I am looking for a used kiln that at least works. The one thing that I always do is I ask them to plug it in and to see if I can test it. I'm not gonna fire it all the way. I just want it to start up, put it on low for about 10 minutes or so. I put my hands a little bit close to the elements and I see, along with all the visual markers that I named off earlier, see if they warm up in time. If this kiln's off for like 10 minutes and I don't hear any sounds, I don't see anything light up on the kiln, I don't feel the elements heating up, I don't buy it. Absolutely not. At this point, you're basically selling me something that looks used and is used to such a point that I don't even hear it turn on. This is probably the most important part because technically speaking, all the other stuff that I talked about can be fixed. I can patch up those cracks. I can get new brick for the kiln. I can get new elements. I can probably install them myself with a little bit of time and knowledge. But if something's wrong with the actual box on the kiln itself, the electrical components, these are much harder to fix. Usually it's not suggested that you try and fix them yourself unless you're very experienced. And at this point you're trying to sell me a dud. You're trying to jebait me. And I shall not be jebated. That's the one thing that I do whenever I'm looking for a used kiln. I'm a very blunt person in general, so I usually look at it, I can tell the state of it just by experience, and then I go, okay, let's plug it in and see how it goes. If they get nervous face or they're like, oh, I don't think you should plug it in, you can't plug it in, then the deal's off. I just walk away from it. This is actually a really good time to mention this because I just got a message on my Facebook page from someone who bought a used kiln and they tried to put the sitter up, right? But the sitter actually didn't reach the switch. The inside, the thermocouple was fine, right? The inside of the sitter was fine where you put the cone so it melts off, right? That was fine. But the switch, the clasp was up here. And usually, if you've seen the videos, I'm about to do charades, please excuse me. Usually there's a hook and a flap. The flap comes up, the hook goes down, and it keeps it here. When the kiln goes off, this hook is released and the thing will drop, and that's what turns off the kiln, right? That's what basically turns off the switch. It seems as though this person got jebaited. They bought a kiln in which the flap, even when you put it down, didn't reach the switch. So it's a very important thing that you ask them if you can plug it in, use it, turn it on. Even if they don't have the proper setup to do that, I would say, okay, well, I'm not buying this until I at least hear it humming, see that it works, feel the elements heating up to some extent. I feel like if that person would have said those words, they could have very easily avoided that situation. Okay, this is the part where we start talking about the actual kilns, the different types of kilns, the different brands of kilns. This is the part where we actually start getting into the nitty-gritty of kilns. Now, there are a bunch of different brands of kilns, and no one brand is better than the other. But each brand does seem to specialize in a certain thing. For example, Even Heat kilns make fantastic tester kilns. They're very small and they have like this panini press kind of style to them where you put stuff in there. They're fantastic for test aisles. They're really good. Scut kilns are fantastic for production potters like myself and even John. He and I have the same type of kiln, and this kiln takes a while to fill with the size that it is. Olympic kilns come anywhere from really small to really big. Amico kilns are super standard, especially for the homestead potter that's constantly just selling work. Scut kilns are kind of the same way, but scut kilns also go down to a small range. Scut kilns are great because their brand, as far as I can see on their websites, also sell tester kilns, which we'll talk about later, but they go from really small to really big, unlike Olympic kilns, which go from small to like super duper like industrial size big. There are so many different types of kilns and brands, and the companies always sell a bunch of different types of kilns, but each one seems to specialize in a certain thing in one way or another. I have Scut, I have Cress, I have Amco, I have Even Heated Olympic galore. You want Scut kilns? I have one of those. I only need one. Sorry. I know you want to hear the rest of the song, but I'm going to stop there before I get massively demonetized. Disney is ruthless. Now for the list that we're going to be using today, we're going to be using Clay King's website. They're not a sponsor of mine or anything. It's just that while I look through the internet and I see all these listings of kilns, they seem to have dedicated pages to a specific kiln, while Clay King seems to put them all in this kind of order where you can see the actual kiln, the dimensions of the kiln, the temperature that it goes up to maximum temperature, and the voltage of the kiln all at once. And I don't have to go to a separate page to look at a separate kiln. They just list all of them right there. And if you want an in-depth look at one single individual kiln, you just click that one. This is way better for navigation and looking at a bunch of different kilns versus like going to another website, clicking that, scrolling down, and then going back 2 times. It just saved me a lot of time, and the listings are all right here. It's fantastic. Now, as I said before, there are a bunch of different companies that make kilns, and there's also a bunch of different kilns. For example, I've been throwing around the word tester kiln a lot. Tester kiln is something that I'm personally interested in because they seem to be something that an intermediate to advanced person would like. For example, I like to make my own glazes. When I make my own glazes, I have to have a way to test them. But I'm not exactly going to make 2 or 3 little pieces or test styles and put them in this big kiln and fire it off, now am I? Well, tester kilns are amazing because you can pretty much just plug them in. I think a lot of them just take regular old sockets like this one, and you can put your 2 or 3 little pieces in there and they will test it out. This can be your sample size for a larger batch. This saves you time, space, money, they fire fairly quickly, and many of them go up to cone 10 even. This is also kind of good for someone who just wants to play around a little bit, maybe get a little bit of a jewelry thing going on with clay, just because people like me are the ones that need to be testing stuff constantly because we're constantly pushing out stuff. John would probably benefit from one, Tim, Sue, we would all want tester kilns so that we don't have to waste our time producing a bunch of stuff in order to put like one test style in here every single time we fire off a kiln. This way we can have 4 or 5 hours, plug it in, have it go, have it come out the next day, and we have our answer for whether this glaze works or not. On the other side of the spectrum, there are industrial sized kilns. They are, as the name suggests, for industry purposes. You can fit an entire huge cartload. I'm sure some of you have even seen footage of somebody putting like a giant trolley into an industrial sized kiln. These are meant for people who do very large sculptures, or people who are mass producing Walmart wear pretty much. Just a bunch of the same thing over and over and over and over again. You get a large yield in a long amount of time, but that amount of yield will last you a long time. So this is a way to do a large body of work in one singular time. They're very expensive. The setup for it is very complicated. I wouldn't suggest them for a beginner, but I just wanted to show you the 2 different spectrums in between the massively colossus and the very tiny, where you can fit like a piece in there. Let's start off with Scut, and let's go with the Scut all the way from the small to what I would suggest is the big. As we take a look at the listings on Clay King, we first see the Scut KM Firebox. Point, KM actually stands for Kiln Master. Kiln Master is the brand of kiln that Scut usually puts out. Usually, whenever you see a Scut brand kiln, it'll be a KM something something. For example, mine is a KMT 1027. KM stands for Kiln Master, T stands for touchscreen. So if I ever ordered one, I would say, hey, can I get a KMT 1027? And they would know exactly what I'm talking about based on the model and the make of it. The dimensions of the firebox are 8 by 8 by 6, and it only takes 115 volts. It's actually not that expensive. I'm willing to bet that you can just plug this thing right in. Now, technically speaking, at the top here, it does say that these are for dolls and jewelry, but many potters that I know will usually use these as tester kilns. Tester kilns are basically, I guess, the slang that we would use for small kilns. And we don't mean small as in my old kiln. We mean small as in like literally a tiny little box that you can fire 1 or 2 pieces in. They're very good for jewelry if that's the thing you're looking for. They're very good for making little tiny sculptures of dolls. They're very good for testing glazes and things of that nature. These types of kilns are really good for people who make clay jewelry and little dolls because you can fit a large amount of them in a very small space. I can't imagine a world where I'm going to fill up a KM 1027 full of jewelry. It's just not happening. I would need a more flat and even surface. This is also awesome because it saves your back, and a lot of potters don't know what I'm talking about right now, but if you load your kiln over the years, you will have to bend that boutée over into your kiln, where half of your body is going to be like down here. Moving on to the KM818, this is 17.5 by 18 inches. It's fairly good for hobbyists. This is a really good kiln for a beginner. The awesome thing about the KM818 is that it only takes, I think it takes a 30 amp breaker. Technically, every breaker that you see, it's going to take less amps. So for example, my kiln takes like 48 or 50 amps of energy, but I need a 60 amp breaker. The KM818 is gonna need a 30 amp breaker, but it takes like, I think 26 or 27 amps of energy. This size of kiln is considered a small size kiln. It's awesome for hobby potters because it goes all the way up to cone 10. And in my personal experience, whenever I get a kiln that can go up to cone 10, but I don't take it up to cone 10, it seems to last a little bit longer. I don't have any real proof to back that up. But with a lot of other kilns that I'm seeing, if you take the kiln all the way up to max temperature each and every time, you're pushing the limit of the kiln, right? And so you're basically just, I hate to keep going back to the car analogy, but you're pushing it to max speed all day, every day, right? KM818 is also awesome because what we talked about earlier. It's gonna cost you maybe around $2,000 if you buy it on the high end, $1,500 if you buy on the low end, but all the extra stuff that you're gonna need to do before you get the kiln in the house is gonna drain your pockets. Right? So altogether, you should have 3 G's for this one kiln. I can't say it enough, this kiln is really good for the hobby potter. Friend of the channel, Lindsay M. Dillon, actually has one of these, and she makes fantastic artwork inside of that kiln. It also doesn't take a lot to fill. You can kind of fill it within 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. But this kiln here, unless I'm pumping stuff out all day and all night long, this is kind of a larger, better version of the KM818. It's honestly just bigger and takes more amps to run. That being said, I can fit probably 150 to 200 pounds worth of product in this kiln right here. The KM818 can probably fit maybe 75, maybe 100 if you're stacking it really well. And just for the visual component, my kiln, pretty tall, pretty big, right? I'm a sizable 200-pound human being, right? This is my kiln. You can see the size comparison next to me. The KM818 is about this big, right? So I have this much space and it's less wide than my kiln is. Before buying the 1027, I was actually really looking at that kiln because I was having the ampage problems that I talked about earlier. Let's take a look at the KM1022. Definitely bigger than the KM818, but it's not as big as the KM1027 I have behind me here. It's a little bit more wide than it is tall. This kiln will run you about $25,000, maybe on the higher end, closer to $30,000, which is definitely a jump from the KM818. The KM1022 is 23.38 inches by 22. It goes all the way up to cone 10, and here's the kicker. It still usually needs a 60 amp breaker, which means you're either gonna have to upgrade or you're gonna have to have a dedicated breaker changed out for 60 amps. With the KM818, you can have a 30 amp breaker. My dryer or my washer probably takes 30 or 40 amps. It probably looks just like a dryer plug. I haven't seen the plug to it, but I'm willing to bet that's what it looks like. Because the KM1022 has a 60 amp, I'm willing to bet, I can't even see it right here, right? But I'm willing to bet it has a different plug, and you're definitely gonna have to get a whole different setup for your breaker box for it. If you got real desperate with the 818, you can just change out your washer dryer whenever you wanna use it or not. But this, you're probably gonna have to have a whole new setup. Oh, what's this sexy kiln right here? Oh, you see that? Look, it's you. This one is the KM1027. It's 23.38 by 27 inches, which is a whole like 4 inches wider or taller than the last kiln we just looked at, the 1022. It honestly doesn't make that much of a difference, and the price tag is also really close to the 1022. Here's the price tag for the 1022, and here's the price tag for the 1027, right? But you're basically paying 50 bucks or so, maybe even 100 at max, to get like 4 extra inches all the way around, which isn't bad. It does go up to cone 10, but you also need a 60 amp breaker, as I mentioned earlier, with this specific kiln. The one thing I could say about this kiln, much like the 818, is that it's basically for a hobbyist potter, but it meets that middle ground in between a productionist and a hobbyist, much like myself, right? I started this off as a hobby, and now I'm starting to produce work, and this thing takes me maybe like a month to fill, but I need multiple clay bags in order to fill this. Keep in mind, I do trim and recycle all my own clay, but still, I do have to put a considerable amount of work and time to fill this. Otherwise, there's no reason for me to fire it. I'm not gonna fill it up halfway and then fire it. Lindsay does just fine with her KM818, but she can only make a certain amount of cups at a time. I don't know how many she can fit in there, but she seems to get a lot, but she's very good at what she does, right? And she's been working with it for a little bit. But I'm willing to bet she can probably fit triple the amount of mugs and bisque inside of one of these KM1027s than she would her 818. Let's do a big scut kiln, just for the heck of it. Let's do a really big one. This is the KM1627, and it is a thick boy. It is 46 by 30.5 inches. It is huge in comparison to this. You would have to put 2 of these next to each other and then round out the difference of like the 8 size. It will run you almost double the price of the KMT 1027, running at about $6,000. Them 6 G's. That's the amount of money it would take for me to like go to Japan on a non-business trip and just frolic around for a week. Yeah, I said a week. I eat a lot of food. It costs a lot of money. Shut up. This one starts getting into the real dedication point where you're like really producing work. If you have one of these, you need to be making stuff. Otherwise, the payouts really aren't that great. You're also going to need a 90 amp breaker. I would suggest a 100 amp breaker if you can go for it. It doesn't technically take 90 or 100 amps. I think when I was looking at the schematics right here, yeah, it technically takes like 68 amps, and at the most it takes 75 amps, but I would not chance it with something this large. This would probably take up a considerable amount of space. The only reason I mention this kiln, knowing that the majority of people aren't looking for this kiln type of information, is just to give you like this is how big they can go for even a hobbyist. We just went anywhere from the small kilns, which are tester kilns, all the way up to the Colossus, which is still technically good for a hobby potter, but you really need to be producing some work to pay yourself back dividends from that type of not only electricity drain, but the amount of work you're putting into something like that. At that point, you need to be having a purpose behind what you're doing and not just feel like doing it for practice or feel like doing it because you're a hobby potter. You better be having some products come out of something that large. Do keep in mind that they all have very specific electrical requirements to them. The smaller kilns, you can kind of just plug right into an American-sized plug, I think. The last one I saw literally just like plugged into an outlet. I didn't have to change anything over. But the smaller kilns, usually around the teens in height, 17, 18 inches tall, are the ones that not only need a dedicated breaker, but they also need their own ampage, right? 30, 40 amps, much like a washer or dryer. It really starts to get into the big boy phase when you go to the 60 amps. And those things are 24, 25, 26 tall. And then you start getting into like the almost industrial type of hobby potter. I know those two don't mix, but you know what I mean, and I know you know what I mean. How dare you? And these definitely aren't the say-all be-all, all the sizes for every single type of kiln. I just don't want the video to go on too long because it's probably already pretty long, but this is really informative stuff. For those reasons, I'm not going to go over some of the other kilns, like those panini press ones. I don't know what they're actually called. I know that Even Heat makes them, and I love them a lot, but I've been calling them panini kilns for a very long time, and no one's corrected me, so that's what they're called now. There's also front loader kilns, there's also coffin kilns. These are all amazing types of kilns, but because I'm guessing a lot of you are about to go into the experience of buying your kiln for the first time, you definitely don't need one of these two. This one here is for really large sculptures, and the coffin kiln aptly named because it can fit pretty much a whole human body in there. I shouldn't say that. I'm about to incriminate myself. I didn't kill anybody and put them in a kiln. I'm just saying it totally could fit a human body in there, like if you had to. Click like and subscribe, please. Now let's talk about some of the things that I would have liked to know before I bought a kiln used or brand new, or otherwise. These are just little tiny preferences specifically for me that I like personally. For example, I really like manual kilns a lot, but I also really like touchscreen kilns. I don't like the box ones though. If it's not manual or it's not touchscreen, I don't want to deal with it. I don't like the box with all the numbers on it. I don't know why. I think it's just a me thing. For example, I also like reduction kilns, gas fire kilns at Cone 10 that I had to work with at the college that I learned through my teacher. They're fantastic because you really get to feel and watch the fire kind of come to life. So let's talk about some of the personal preferences you might want to consider when you're buying yourself a kiln, new or used, to be honest with you. So one of the things that I really appreciate about the newer Scut kilns is that they have this right here, which allows for venting at 3 different levels. I can put it right here if I want it to stay closed, number 1, but it still has a little bit of wiggle room, right? I can put it right here. Usually I would do this after a glaze load if I just want a little bit of space. I can put it right here if I'm doing a bisque load and I really want a lot of oxygen to get through into the chamber. And sometimes if I'm having a real good day, and I'm pretty sure they didn't intend for me to do this, but I'll put it right here if I want a lot of air to get into there. Maybe I'm firing some darker clay, maybe I'm firing some Cassius. That's the type of thing that I want, like a lot of oxygen in the kiln, and it matters in my bisque load because it will affect my glaze load later on, especially with clay with a lot of impurities in it. My old kiln, I used to have to do one of these. My used kiln, I used to have to do this, and if I was firing some type of darker clay, I would get this brick and just do this. So even if you are buying a used kiln, I suggest you get something to kind of prop it to vent. That being said, I do appreciate this a lot because this kind of gets rid of this. I just have this for sentimental value at this point, to be honest with you. A lot of kilns will also have handles on the side. I do very much appreciate this, but the ones that I like the most, because I have dealt with kilns that do not have this, are these clasps here. Each section is technically individual. When I towed this in, I had to put them on top of each other. I put the stand there, then level 1, 2, 3, and it went fine, but these handles allow me to carry it, and these clasps make me feel way better about having them actually shut together to keep all the heat in. This is not a point of like, oh no, if you don't have this, it's crazy, this is a bad kiln. It's more of, this just puts my mind at ease. If you can find a used kiln, if you're buying one with some of this action on it, that'd be awesome. Another thing that I really like is this bar right here. This bar goes all the way up, and sooner or later it'll clasp onto this little hitch right here, and it'll just let my kiln stay up without me touching it. I could not do this with the earlier kiln that I worked with. It didn't have this. Not only did it not have this, and if I want it even wider, which I rarely do, I could put it way up here, which I absolutely don't need, but it's nice to still have that option. Going back to this might seem a little bit trivial, but you know, the sooner or later, I imagine I'll have a dog in the studio, or kids, or something, or there might be roommates coming around the house. Maybe the queen comes over and wants to check the kiln. For some reason, this just makes me feel better knowing that this is clasped shut. I know many potters, especially with the older kilns, that just shut it, and shutting it is fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Everyone can kind of feel, based on their common senses, which is getting more rare these days, to be honest with you, that they probably shouldn't go near this and touch it. It's burning hot. That being said, to make sure it's closed, I can definitely clasp it closed. I don't want my 4-year-old, if I ever had one in this house, coming over here and jiggling this open and touching the stuff inside and burning himself. This will keep it closed. There's a very low chance that I have someone in this house that has that low of an IQ, but to people who don't know any better, this kind of puts reassurance on it. Those are just some of the things that I appreciate now more than ever because I didn't have any of those features with my old used kiln. And they're absolutely not necessary to run a kiln or have a good functional amount of artwork that looks fantastic. I was making stuff way back in the channel, but now it's just easier and I have peace of mind. The touchscreen model here actually doesn't cost that much to install, and it came with an application that attaches to my phone that tells me exactly how much money I spent each and every time I fire my kiln, when it's done, what degrees it's at, whenever it's on. It has Wi-Fi attached to it. Those are all things I don't need, but I will say they're all very comforting. It's also super cool whenever someone's like, oh man, but kilns are so expensive, a lot of electricity. No, not really. I can literally pull up the amount of money it costs every time I fire it. It might cost $9 to $12 each and every time I load it, whether it's bisque or glaze. And glaze, for me, usually takes a lot less long than bisque does, because bisque I do slow, I don't want everything to crack. that wasn't really an important thing to include in this video. I just wanted to kind of side with all the people who are having arguments with their spouses right now, who are like,
no, we can't get a kiln in the house because it costs too much money, honey.
This way you can literally be like, yeah, no, it costs $9 each and every time I fire this thing, and I fire it once a month. How much does your beer cost again? I'm just gonna put gas on that fire and we're gonna move right on. And now we've reached the part of the video where I am going to give you one solid suggestion to the kiln that I would have bought, or I wish I would have had the ability or the time and space and electricity to buy and have if I were a new person who had all those things and the knowledge that I have now. I would have absolutely bought the Scut KM818. It is small, it is compact. With the skill set that I had before, there's no way I would have been able to fill that thing like every 3 weeks and glaze them. Now, I don't think a lot of people are looking for the higher version of what the KM818 is, which is the 1027 pretty much, or at least the 1022, which is just much larger. I don't think a lot of people are looking to wait months at a time. And keep in mind, it takes me like a month to fill this, and I work pretty fast. I trim all my stuff, I recycle all my clay. I'm fairly experienced in my own field, if I do say so myself. And it still takes me quite some time to fill something of this level up. This is quite a large kiln. I could fit a whole toddler in here. I need to stop saying I can put people inside kilns. I'm gonna incriminate myself. But the KM818 is just small enough for someone who's getting into the art world and really still practicing their forms and really still learning to work with their kiln to fill it up in a month, do the bisque thing, have nice control over it, have everything set up, and it comes with all the bells and whistles minus the touchscreen if you didn't buy it that mine has. All those things I named earlier with this little flappy part right here, I don't know what it's called, this little flappy flap. It comes with all the bells and whistles that I have. It's just smaller. You would literally be buying a smaller version of what I have. And my kiln costs about 3 G's. The KM818 costs like half of that amount. And you know, it basically is half of the kiln. But for most beginners who are looking to buy a kiln of this nature and this type, and they're a hobby potter, they're just getting into the art, it's gonna take them a while to fill even the 818. And you don't need one this big and expensive. You really don't. You just got your license. You might have just got your first wheel. You don't need a Rari. I'm not buying you the Lambo. I'm not gonna buy you the Lambo you just got your license. I don't care if you just graduated. You're 18. I'm not buying an 18-year-old a Lambo. It's not happening. Get some grit underneath you and then we'll come back and talk. Takes a low amount of ampage, as for mine takes double the amount of amps. It's not gonna take like less electricity to such a dramatic amount that it's gonna matter that much on your bill. But it is gonna take way less setup. If you go to an electrician, you have a 100 amp house, and you go, hey, can you set me up a 30 amp breaker? He's gonna go, yeah. So you want like a washer dryer? You show them the plug and they go, yeah, okay, that looks like a washer dryer. They're gonna plug it right in for you. It's a very easy thing to do for electricians. In fact, the electrician that came over to set my stuff up was like, you sure you don't want an 818? Cause like, you sure? Then I threw money at him and all of a sudden he just stopped asking me if I was sure. It went away, it was like magic. It's much cheaper, it costs way less amps, it takes up way less room. You don't need as big of a space to store it into. It's very easy to move, in fact. I picked Lindsay's up one time and well, I didn't pick Lindsay's up, I picked up the model of Lindsay's, not Lindsay's. That would be rude. But I can pretty much carry them by myself. As for this thing, I need 2 people to carry, absolutely. Or I'm carrying it in parts and using like a skateboard to trolley it down the street to wherever it's going. It's just an easier operation for people who are just getting into the art world. I would heavily suggest getting a Scut 818. For sure, honorary mentions to Amico and Paragon, who also sell kilns that are very close to the same Scut schematics. I'm kind of just a Scut fanboy because all of my kilns that I really like have been Scut, and all the other ones have been like, somebody built a Cone 10 reduction kiln and I used that. There's no brand on that, somebody made that. I built my own Pitfire kiln, there's no brand on that, I made that. There's a Raku kiln. Raku kilns really don't have a brand. You guys want to go over one ridiculous one before we head out? Just in case anyone's still here, we can have a little fun. Let's go over like one ridiculous kiln before we go, okay? Leave your comments below to tell me what would you put in a kiln this size? Don't say a person. Don't say a person. This kiln here is called the Easy Load EL3048. It is 31 width by 31 depth by 48 height. It takes up 240 volts minimum. It comes with a quite impressive price tag. at $23,450, and we're not even gonna mention the tax. The direct wire or the breaker to run this bad boy is 175 amps. That's a lot of damage. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I know this video has been long requested. I also know that this is a very long video. If you made it all the way through, leave me a comment down below. Tell me what you would put inside of that giant kiln that we just talked about right now. Don't say a person. But like realistically though, all the people who don't put their shopping carts away. If you'd like to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below. The Facebook, the Instagram, all the things, all the contacts and all the informations and all the things that I said I would put down below are absolutely down below in the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. This is a very long video. It's gonna take a lot of edit time. Hope you guys feel a little bit better about buying your first kilns, especially if you're buying a used one. I put in all the stuff that I would do when buying a used kiln. If you have any comments down below for other people, for like little stuff that you want to check that I didn't mention, go ahead, put it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys. Just be nice to each other. Hopefully you guys feel a little bit more confident in buying your kilns, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week. Please don't be mad at me. He didn't put his grocery shopping cart back, so he deserved what he got.